Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we're setting sail into the world of the Vikings, a people who left behind myths, sagas, and mysteries that still spark our imagination today. When most people hear the word Viking, they picture horned helmets and endless raids. But the truth is far more fascinating. These were explorers who built ships that could cross oceans, traders who reached from Baghdad to the icy north, and storytellers who filled long winter nights with tales of gods and heroes. They were farmers, poets, adventurers, and yes, warriors too, but always far more complex than legend makes them seem. In this video, we'll drift through 100 captivating facts about Viking life, belief, and legacy. You'll discover how they navigated by the sun and stars, what foods warmed them during cold winters, the surprising places they traveled, and the unusual traditions they carried with them. If you enjoy learning in this gentle way, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a like, or share your thoughts in the comments. It really helps this channel grow. But for now, you don't need to do anything at all. Just get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and allow the stories of the past to carry you along, as if you were lying on the deck of a longship under the northern lights. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. Long before Columbus sailed west, Norse voyagers had already set foot on North American shores. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, led an expedition that reached a land they called Vinland. Archaeological evidence at Lansor Meadows in Newfoundland confirms a Norse settlement there, complete with buildings, ironworking, and traces of daily life. For the Vikings, this was the edge of the known world, a place with wild grapes, rich forests, and abundant game. The settlement did not last, but the journeys show that these explorers had already crossed the Atlantic nearly 500 years before Columbus. What's most striking is the audacity of it. To leave Greenland, sail into the unknown, and find new continents with nothing but wooden ships, stars, and instinct to guide them. It was one of history's great acts of daring exploration. The word Viking may not mean what you think. Today, we use Viking to describe the people of Scandinavia during the age of exploration and raids. But in Old Norse, to go a Viking was more like a verb. It meant to set out on an expedition overseas, often for raiding or trading. Not everyone in Norse society was a Viking. Most were farmers, craftspeople, or traders. Those who chose the adventurous life of seafaring expeditions were the ones who went Viking. So when we speak of Vikings, we are really naming an activity rather than an entire culture. This subtle shift in meaning shows how history has reshaped language. To the Norse themselves, being a Viking was not an identity you were born with, but a role you could take on. One season a farmer, the next a sailor, and perhaps later a raider or trader on distant shores. Vikings sometimes used ravens to find land. Sailing across vast seas without modern tools required creativity. The Vikings sometimes carried ravens aboard their ships as living navigation aids. When they suspected land was nearby, they could release a raven. If the bird circled and returned, they knew no land was close. If it flew straight in one direction and did not come back, the sailors had a clue to follow. The sagas tell of Floki Vilhjalmsson, an explorer who released 3 ravens during his voyage and eventually found Iceland, earning the nickname Raven Floki. This method may sound simple, but it shows how attuned the Vikings were to the natural world, reading not only stars and winds, but the behavior of animals to survive. The image of a dark raven winging across endless grey seas captures the quiet determination of sailors who trusted nature itself to be their guide. The sagas describe Greenland as green land to attract settlers. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, sailed west and discovered a new land with icy fjords and harsh winters. To make the place appealing to potential settlers, he called it Greenland. The name was partly wishful thinking and partly clever marketing. By painting a vision of fertile pastures, Eric convinced others to follow him across the sea and establish colonies there. Archaeological remains of Viking farms in Greenland show that settlers raised cattle, sheep, and goats, carving out a precarious life on the edge of the Arctic. The name stuck, even though much of the land was anything but green. This little piece of rebranding reveals that the Vikings, while fierce in reputation, could also be shrewd in persuasion. Greenland remains one of history's most effective pieces of advertising, a name chosen to make people believe in possibility rather than reality. Vikings didn't actually wear horned helmets. The image of a Viking in a horned helmet is one of history's most enduring myths, but it comes not from archaeology, but from 19th century opera. Costume designers for Wagner's Ring Cycle added horns to helmets for dramatic effect, and the image stuck. Real Viking helmets were practical, often made of iron or leather, designed to protect in battle without catching or snagging. Horns would have been dangerous in close combat, giving enemies something to grab. Archaeologists have found only one nearly complete Viking helmet from Geirmombu in Norway, and it is entirely hornless. The truth is that the horned image is more symbolic than real. It reflects how later cultures imagined the Vikings, rather than how they actually dressed. The myth remains powerful, though, because it captures that sense of wildness and otherworldly presence that the Vikings themselves surely inspired. Their ships could sail in only a meter of water. One of the most extraordinary things about Viking longships was their shallow draft. Many of them could float and maneuver in barely a meter of water, allowing them to glide not only across open seas, but also far inland along winding rivers. This meant that Viking crews could strike at coastal villages, sail upriver to surprise inland towns, and escape quickly by slipping away into waterways where heavier ships could never follow. The same quality also gave them an edge in exploration. These vessels could land directly on beaches without needing harbors, letting the Norse establish settlements in far-flung places. Their ships were not simply tools of war, but marvels of engineering, flexible enough for raiding, trading, and discovery. The ability to move so easily between sea and river made the Vikings far more mobile than almost any other people of their time. They left graffiti inside the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. When Viking warriors traveled east, some entered the service of the Byzantine Empire as elite guards known as the Varangians. Their travels took them to Constantinople, the greatest city of the medieval world, filled with golden mosaics and towering domes. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the empire's great cathedral, these Norsemen left their mark in the form of carved graffiti. On the marble balustrades, faint inscriptions can still be seen, runic letters etched by steady hands, perhaps during long hours of duty. One reads something like, "Halfdan was here, a timeless message echoing across 1,000 years." It is astonishing to imagine a Viking warrior, far from home, standing beneath glittering mosaics of angels, carving his name to prove he had reached the very heart of the empire. These small scratches bring us face to face with individuals who once walked through that immense space. Vikings measured wealth in cows as well as silver. Silver coins and arm rings were valuable in Viking society, but so were cows. Livestock represented real wealth. They provided milk, meat, hides, and status. Land was measured not only in acres, but in how many cattle it could sustain. A man's prosperity could be judged by the size of his herd, and cows often served as the standard for fines, compensation, or dowries. In fact, the very word fee comes from the Old Norse fe, which meant both cattle and money. This dual meaning reminds us of how deeply farming shaped everyday Viking life. Even the fiercest raider was often also a farmer who needed his animals to survive. When the sagas tell of disputes, the loss of a cow could spark as much anger as the loss of coins. For the Vikings, wealth was both silver that glittered and the quiet strength of cattle. Some Viking swords had names passed down for generations. In Viking culture, a sword was more than a weapon. It was a companion, a symbol of honor, and sometimes even a character in its own right. Exceptional swords were often given names such as Legbiter or Schofnung, and sagas described them with almost magical reverence. These blades could be passed from father to son, carrying the weight of lineage and reputation. Forged with intricate pattern welding, they gleamed with rippling lines in the metal, making them objects of beauty as well as tools of war. To wield a named sword was to inherit not only its steel, but also its history, the deeds it had already been part of. Just as stories were preserved in sagas, so too were they preserved in the very metal of these heirlooms, linking generations of Vikings through blades that outlasted their owners. Viking helmets were usually made of iron or leather. The image of the Viking helmet is often a gleaming dome, but in truth, most helmets were practical and varied. Iron helmets provided strong protection but were expensive. So many warriors wore simpler leather caps reinforced with metal. Archaeologists have found helmets with nose guards, cheek plates, and even full masks with stylized iron eyebrows. Each design reflected the resources and craftsmanship available. Helmets were rare and valuable, often passed down like swords. Many warriors may have gone into battle with nothing more than a shield and courage. The fact that so few helmets have survived suggests how precious they were, items to be mended, reused, and treasured. While not as flashy as horned designs from later imagination, real Viking helmets tell us something more intimate. These were tools of survival, carefully crafted for men who risked their lives on the battlefield. Vikings buried ships with their dead. For the Vikings, ships were more than transport. They were symbols of life's journey and vehicles to the afterlife. When a powerful person died, they were sometimes buried inside a ship, laid to rest with weapons, jewelry, animals, and even entire households of belongings. The most famous examples, such as the Osberg ship in Norway, reveal wooden vessels carefully placed into the earth, covered with mounds of soil. Within, archaeologists have discovered woven tapestries, carved sleighs, intricate wagons, and everyday tools, all intended to accompany the dead into eternity. These ship burials were not common for everyone. They were reserved for the elite, those whose memory deserved grandeur. To stand before one of these excavated ships today is to feel the weight of Viking belief. That death was not an ending, but a voyage, and a ship was the truest vessel for the soul. Women could divorce their husbands in Viking society. Unlike in much of medieval Europe, Viking women held a surprising amount of legal power. They could own property, manage farms, and, if needed, divorce their husbands. If a marriage became unbearable, perhaps through neglect or mistreatment, a woman could declare her separation in front of witnesses, often at the household doorway. Divorce did not carry the stigma it later acquired in Christian Europe. Instead, it was recognized as part of life, a way to preserve dignity and fairness in society. This autonomy was woven into the sagas, where women are portrayed not merely as background figures, but as decisive voices shaping events. Shield maidens may capture the imagination, but in reality, the legal rights of Viking women may have been even more powerful. It reveals a society far more complex than stereotypes of raiding warriors suggest, where women's roles were respected in meaningful ways. Vikings skied for fun and travel. In snowy Scandinavia, skis were not just a means of moving across winter landscapes, they were also a source of joy. Archaeological finds show that skis were used as early as the Iron Age, and by the Viking period, they had become common tools. Made from wood and strapped with bindings, they allowed hunters and travelers to glide across frozen ground. But the Norse also skied for sport. The sagas tell of competitions, races, and even playful references to gods and heroes who excelled at skiing. In fact, the god Ulla was celebrated as a deity of skiing and hunting. Skis made survival easier in harsh winters, letting people traverse forests or chase game. Yet they also offered leisure, a rare kind of play in a world of hard work. When Vikings strapped on their skis, they embraced both necessity and delight, sliding across the silent snow. Viking warriors sometimes carried double-headed axes. Axes were one of the most iconic Viking weapons. Most were simple single-bladed tools that doubled as farm implements and weapons in war. But sagas and archaeological finds suggest that some warriors carried more elaborate axes, including double-headed designs. These rare axes were heavier, more symbolic, and perhaps ceremonial as much as practical. More common, however, were broad-bladed battle axes with crescent-shaped edges, capable of slicing through shields and armor. The sight of a Viking warrior with a massive axe was enough to terrify opponents. Unlike swords, which were costly and treasured, axes were accessible to many, making them weapons of both the farmer and the raider. Their presence in graves and sagas reveals not just utility, but identity, the axe as a defining feature of Viking strength. Whether simple or ornate, the axe was a tool that bound together daily life and battle. They used runestones as messages to the future. All across Scandinavia, tall stones etched with runes still stand, carved more than 1,000 years ago. These runestones were the Viking way of leaving words for future generations. They often commemorated the dead, proclaiming who had raised the stone and for whom. Some told of journeys across seas, battles fought, or lands inherited. Others included intricate carvings of beasts, knots, and even scenes from Norse myth. To walk among them today is to wander through a silent forest of voices, each one echoing from the Viking age. Unlike paper or parchment, these stones were meant to endure, weathering wind and time. They remind us that the Vikings cared deeply about memory and legacy. Every runestone was an act of permanence, a declaration to those yet unborn. We were here, we lived, and we left our names written in stone. Vikings played board games similar to chess. Even fierce raiders found time for quiet games. Among their favorite pastimes was Hnefatafl, a board game of strategy and cunning. Played on a checkered grid with carved pieces, it pitted a defending king and his guards against attackers trying to capture him. The game was asymmetric, requiring careful planning, foresight, and bold moves, much like real battles. Archaeologists have found gaming boards and pieces made of bone, amber, and wood in Viking settlements and graves, showing how beloved the pastime was. These games weren't just for fun. They reflected the strategic thinking valued in warriors and leaders. To imagine a Viking family gathered by the fire, rolling dice or playing taffel while snow fell outside, is to glimpse the quieter side of their world. Beyond raids and voyages, they also cherished moments of mental challenge and playful rivalry, a human touch across the centuries. Their homes often had one long fire in the center. Viking longhouses were the heart of family life, wooden halls that stretched long and narrow, with turf roofs for insulation. At the center of these homes burned a single, continuous fire. This hearth provided warmth in freezing winters, light in dark nights, and heat for cooking stews of meat, fish, and grain. Families would gather around the flames, telling stories, repairing tools, or simply keeping close. Smoke curled upward through a hole in the roof, filling the hall with a faint haze. The smell of wood smoke, animals kept indoors, and warm bread would have defined the atmosphere. This communal fire was more than practical. It was symbolic, a living center of the household, tended carefully as if it were itself a member of the family. For Vikings, the fire was life, and its glow stitched together work, play, and the rhythm of survival. Vikings used walrus ivory as currency. Far to the north, in the icy waters of Greenland, walruses provided a valuable trade good: ivory. The Vikings hunted these massive creatures for their long tusks, which could be carved into ornaments, gaming pieces, or even religious artifacts sold in distant markets. Walrus ivory became a kind of currency, highly prized in Europe before elephant ivory became common. Merchants carried tusks across the seas to cities as far away as Constantinople, where wealthy buyers coveted the gleaming material. One of the most famous medieval artifacts, the Lewis chessman discovered in Scotland, is believed to have been carved from walrus ivory. This trade connected the remote Viking colonies of Greenland to the wider world, proving that even at the edge of the Arctic, Norse hunters were part of a vast economic web. Ivory was not just decoration, it was a passport into global commerce. Norse traders reached Baghdad and the Silk Road. The Vikings were not only raiders, but also extraordinary traders. Traveling along the rivers of Russia in sleek longships, Norse merchants reached as far as Baghdad, a city of dazzling splendor and culture at the heart of the Islamic world. Arab chroniclers describe the fair-haired northerners who arrived with furs, amber, and slaves, eager to exchange for silver, silk, and spices. Some Vikings may have traveled even farther, tapping into the Silk Road that stretched across Asia. The discovery of coins from the Abbasid Caliphate in Viking hordes across Scandinavia proves how interconnected these worlds were. Imagine a trader from Sweden, born among pine forests and fjords, walking through the bustling streets of Baghdad, surrounded by domes, markets, and scents of cinnamon. The Norse were not isolated. They were participants in a global network that spanned continents and cultures, centuries before the modern age of exploration. Vikings wore bright clothing dyed with plants. Forget the image of drab furs and dark tunics. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking clothing was often brightly colored. They used natural dyes made from plants and lichens, blues from woad, reds from madry root, yellows from birch leaves or weld. Wealthier Vikings could afford richer shades, like deep crimson or imported silks, while common folk still enjoyed splashes of color on their everyday garments. Bright clothes were both practical and symbolic, helping distinguish status and adding life to long winters. Sagas even describe heroes wearing cloaks of vivid hues, and grave finds reveal carefully woven textiles that still show traces of their original brilliance. Picture a Viking marketplace, not a sea of brown and grey, but a scene alive with reds, blues, and yellows against the northern sky. In their dress, as in their ships and art, the Vikings celebrated vibrancy, declaring life in every stitch. They believed in magical charms called seither. In Viking culture, magic was woven into everyday life. One of the most mysterious practices was seither, a form of sorcery believed to shape fate itself. Practitioners could foresee the future, bless harvests, or bring misfortune to enemies. The gods themselves were said to use it. Odin, the Allfather, was its greatest master, though the practice was often associated with women called their lure, or cirruses. Archaeologists have uncovered staffs and ritual objects in graves that may have been tools of seither. To the Vikings, the world was alive with unseen forces, and those who could touch them were both respected and feared. Imagine a Cirrus chanting by firelight, casting charms with carved runes, while villagers listened in silence. Seitho was not simply superstition, but a bridge between human life and the mysterious currents of destiny, showing how deeply the Vikings believed in hidden powers all around them. Berserkers may have fought in trance-like frenzies. The word berserker conjures images of terrifying Viking warriors, and the truth is no less fascinating. These men were said to enter battles in a kind of frenzy, fighting with superhuman strength and seeming impervious to pain. Some accounts describe them wearing animal skins, howling like wolves or roaring like bears as they rushed into combat. The cause of this state is debated. Was it ritual, self-hypnosis, or even the use of hallucinogenic plants? Whatever the origin, the berserker became a legendary figure, inspiring awe and dread. In sagas, they are both admired and feared. Warriors who could break shield walls and terrify opponents with sheer ferocity. Today, the term "going berserk" still echoes from these Norse fighters. Whether exaggerated or real, the idea of men entering altered states of fury reminds us of the powerful blend of myth and reality in Viking life. Vikings trained falcons for hunting. Hunting was not only survival, but also status in Viking society, and falconry was among its most prestigious forms. Wealthy Norsemen kept hawks and falcons, training them to swoop down on game such as birds and hares. These birds of prey were symbols of nobility, requiring skill, patience, and respect to master. Falconry was a tradition shared with other cultures, and Vikings traded trained birds as valuable gifts with rulers abroad. Imagine a Viking chieftain standing in the frosty morning, a falcon perched on his leather glove, eyes sharp and restless as it scanned the sky. When the bird was released, it became a living arrow, diving with breathtaking speed. Such moments captured both the bond between human and animal and the Vikings' reverence for the natural world. Falcons were more than tools of the hunt, they were partners, embodying the grace and wild power of the skies. Some Viking helmets had face masks with iron eyebrows. Among the rare Viking helmets uncovered by archaeologists, a few reveal surprising artistry. Some were not just simple domes, but included face masks with stylized iron eyebrows and nose guards, giving the wearer a fierce, almost otherworldly expression. These features may have been designed to intimidate opponents, transforming the warrior into a figure both human and mythic. To see one of these helmets today is to realize how carefully crafted they were, not only for protection, but for presence. They reflect the Viking blending of function and symbolism. In battle, appearance mattered. A warrior who looked like a spirit or monster might unsettle an enemy before the fight even began. While helmets were rare, those with masks and eyebrows suggest that for some, armor was also identity, a way to wear fear itself as much as iron. Vikings ate reindeer, seals, and even whale. Survival in the north demanded variety, and the Viking diet was wide-ranging. In addition to farmed animals and crops, they hunted reindeer across snowy tundra, fished seals from icy waters, and sometimes feasted on whale meat when opportunity arose. These foods supplemented everyday staples of bread, porridge, fish, and dairy. Archaeological remains show bones of many creatures, from wild birds to massive sea mammals. Such meals reflected both practicality and resourcefulness. Imagine a Viking settlement on a windswept coast, families gathering as strips of seal meat smoked above the fire, or hunters returning with reindeer hides for warmth as well as food. Though we picture raiders, much of Viking life was about adapting to the land and sea. Their ability to use whatever resources nature provided was essential to survival, and part of what allowed them to thrive across such harsh landscapes. Viking ships were symmetrical, so they could reverse quickly. One of the most ingenious features of Viking ships was their symmetry. Both ends of a longship were designed to look nearly identical, which meant that when navigating tricky waters, the vessel could reverse direction without turning around. Sailors simply shifted the oars and the rudder, and the ship could travel back the way it had come. This design was invaluable when exploring unknown coasts or maneuvering in rivers. It also reflected the flexibility the Vikings prized in their vessels. Ships that could sail across open seas, slip into shallow waters, and pivot in an instant. In battle, this symmetry could be life-saving, allowing quick retreats or sudden advances. To stand on such a ship, with the sea stretching endlessly ahead and behind, must have felt like freedom itself, knowing that whichever way the wind or fate turned, the ship could follow. The Vikings founded Dublin. While the Vikings are often remembered for raiding, they were also builders of cities. One of the most famous is Dublin, in Ireland, which began as a Viking settlement in the 9th century. Established along the River Liffey, it became a thriving hub of trade, where Norse merchants exchanged furs, silver, and slaves for goods from across Europe. Over time, Dublin grew into a permanent town, with streets, markets, and fortifications. Archaeological digs there have revealed artifacts of everyday Viking life, combs, tools, and jewelry. What began as a base for raiding eventually became a center of commerce and culture. The very name Dublin comes from the Irish dub linn, meaning black pool, a reference to a dark tidal pool where the Vikings moored their ships. Today's bustling city traces its roots back to those Norse settlers who planted the seeds of urban life on Irish soil. They carved intricate animals into their ship prows. The Viking longship was not only a masterpiece of engineering, but also of artistry. At the prow, carved wooden figures often took the form of dragons, serpents, or other fearsome creatures. These carvings served practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, they may have been intended to frighten enemies or ward off evil spirits at sea. Symbolically, they expressed the power and identity of the crew. To see one of these ships approach from the horizon, a dragon's head rising above the waves, must have been a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Each carving was unique, shaped by the hand of a craftsman who blended imagination with tradition. Today, fragments of these wooden prows survive in museums, their curves still graceful, their presence still commanding. They remind us that the Vikings saw their ships as living beings, companions on voyages across the edge of the known world. Viking laws were recited aloud, not written. In Viking society, law was preserved not on parchment, but in memory. At assemblies called things, a designated official known as the law speaker would recite the legal code aloud for all to hear. These gatherings, often held in open-air spaces, were places where disputes were settled, crimes judged, and agreements made. The oral nature of law meant that memory and clarity were essential. The law speaker had to know every detail and speak it with authority. This tradition also made the law a communal experience, something heard and witnessed together rather than hidden in documents. Imagine a crowd gathered on a hillside, listening as the laws of their land were spoken into the air, binding them by shared understanding. Viking law was not arbitrary but deeply structured, emphasizing fairness, restitution, and community. It reveals a society where justice was as public as it was powerful. Vikings sometimes settled disputes with ritual duels. When words and negotiations failed, Vikings sometimes turned to trial by combat to resolve disputes. These ritual duels, called hungans, were fought according to strict rules, often on a designated piece of ground no larger than a cloak spread out on the earth. Two men would face each other with swords or axes, watched by witnesses, and the outcome would decide the case. It was not simply a matter of brute force, but also honor, a way to prove one's courage and claim in front of the community. While dangerous, home gangs were seen as fairer than endless feuds, offering resolution without wider bloodshed. Over time, the practice faded, replaced by more formal legal judgments. But in the sagas, these duels remain vivid, two figures locked in combat, their dispute balanced on the edge of steel, under the eyes of gods and men alike. They discovered Iceland by accident in a storm. The settlement of Iceland began not with a plan, but with chance. According to the sagas, a Norwegian sailor named Nadadar was blown off course by a storm while trying to reach the Faroe Islands. He found himself on an unknown shore, Iceland, covered in snow. Later explorers like Floki Vilduthasson followed, and though Floki found the land harsh and named it Iceland, others saw opportunity. The island became a new frontier, offering farmland, fishing waters, and independence from kings back home. Families crossed the sea in open ships, bringing livestock, tools, and traditions. What began as an accident soon turned into a thriving society, with laws, sagas, and unique culture. Iceland remains one of the most enduring Viking legacies, a nation born from storms and stubbornness, where a chance discovery turned into a home on the edge of the Arctic. The Norse built the largest wooden halls in Europe. At the heart of Viking communities stood longhouses, and some were immense. Excavations at Borg in Lofoten, Norway, revealed a hall over 80 meters long, the largest wooden building of its age in Europe. These structures were more than homes. They were gathering places where chieftains held feasts, warriors swore oaths, and communities came together in celebration or council. The longhouse embodied power and hospitality, glowing with firelight and echoing with voices. Its length symbolized the reach of the leader who built it. Imagine stepping into such a hall, the smell of roasted meat, smoke drifting toward the rafters, laughter mingling with the clink of cups. These halls were not only shelters but centers of life, where politics, storytelling, and ritual intertwined. They remind us that Viking society valued both strength and fellowship, creating spaces where communities could share their world. Viking hair was often blonde thanks to lye soap. The Vikings cared about appearance, and hair was an important part of that. Archaeological finds of combs, razors, and tweezers show their grooming habits. Interestingly, many men lightened their hair using a strong soap made with lye. This not only bleached the hair to a pale blonde, but also helped control lice. Blonde hair was admired, and those who didn't naturally have it could create the look through this unusual method. The sagas often describe characters by their hair color, emphasizing how important it was in identity and attractiveness. Imagine a Viking washing their hair with this caustic soap, emerging with shining, pale locks that caught the firelight. It's a detail that reminds us that these were not unkempt raiders, but people deeply aware of style, grooming, and presentation, centuries ahead of stereotypes that painted them as wild and unwashed. Vikings believed poetry had magical power. To the Vikings, poetry was more than entertainment. It was almost a form of sorcery. Skilled poets, called skalds, could weave words so powerful they were believed to shape fate or bring honor and disgrace. In Norse mythology, poetry itself was said to have been created from a magical mead brewed from the blood of a wise god, stolen by Odin and shared with chosen poets. To speak in verse was to echo the divine. Kings and chieftains valued skalds highly, rewarding them for immortalizing victories or mocking enemies. The sagas describe poets turning the tide of reputation with their sharp tongues and elegant words. In a culture where memory and honor mattered deeply, poetry was both weapon and treasure. The belief that words carried real force reminds us how differently they saw language, not just as communication, but as a living, magical power. They told riddles during feasts. Feasts were a central part of Viking life, and alongside food, drink, and music, riddles played an important role. Known as gata, these clever puzzles entertained guests and tested wit. The sagas even include riddling contests between gods and giants, where the loser's life would depend on the outcome. Around longhouse fires, riddles would challenge memory, creativity, and quick thinking, sparking laughter or admiration. Imagine a hall filled with smoke and laughter, warriors leaning in to solve a puzzle wrapped in poetic verse. These games of the mind balanced the physical toughness of Viking life with intellectual play. In a world often remembered for raids and battles, the simple act of telling riddles reminds us that the Vikings valued cleverness as much as strength, and that their gatherings were places of joy, wit, and shared imagination. Viking warriors polished their teeth with grooves. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking skeletons with unusual teeth, horizontal grooves filed across the front. These markings were not for chewing, but for display. It seems some warriors deliberately filed their teeth and polished them with pigments, creating striking patterns that would have stood out when they smiled or shouted in battle. The exact purpose is debated, perhaps to intimidate enemies, or as a mark of belonging to a particular group. Whatever the reason, the effect must have been startling. Picture a warrior with gleaming, patterned teeth, lit by firelight or flashing on the battlefield. Far from being primitive, this was a form of body modification, carefully done for visual effect. Like tattoos or jewelry, these grooves show the Vikings' creativity in self-expression. They remind us that appearances were as much a weapon as any axe or sword. Their longships could carry up to 70 warriors. Viking longships were narrow, graceful, and deceptively powerful. The largest could hold as many as 70 warriors, along with supplies and cargo. With both sails and oars, they were fast and flexible, capable of traveling across oceans or darting up rivers. The design allowed for close cooperation, with each man rowing in rhythm, the whole vessel moving as if it were alive. Archaeological finds, like the Roskilde ships, revealed just how finely crafted they were, built to balance speed, strength, and shallow draft. To see one on the horizon would have been both beautiful and terrifying. A sleek vessel cutting through waves filled with armed men. For the Vikings themselves, these ships were lifelines, linking distant shores and carrying them to lands beyond imagination. With 70 men on board, a single ship could project the power of an entire community far across the sea. Vikings bathed more often than most Europeans. Contrary to the stereotype of dirty raiders, Vikings were among the cleanest people of their age. Archaeological discoveries of combs, razors, ear cleaners, and tweezers show their attention to grooming. Written accounts from their contemporaries often remarked on their cleanliness, noting that they bathed at least once a week, far more than many in medieval Europe. Hot springs in Iceland and bathhouses in settlements provided places for washing, while rivers and lakes offered natural baths. This emphasis on hygiene was not just practical but also social, as clean appearance improved one's chances in trade and romance. Imagine a Viking emerging from a steaming pool in the Icelandic landscape, hair washed with lye soap, beard combed, clothes freshly laundered. Far from the image of rough savages, they valued neatness and freshness, understanding that presentation was a powerful part of daily life. They used combs carved from bone and antler. Combs were some of the most common artifacts found in Viking graves and settlements. Made from bone, antler, or occasionally ivory, they were finely carved with patterns, showing that grooming was not just routine, but also artful. Both men and women carried combs, often tucked into pouches or hung from belts, ready for use. These tools were treasured possessions, sometimes buried alongside their owners. The care given to their decoration suggests that they were not just practical objects, but symbols of status and refinement. Imagine a Viking carefully combing his beard before a feast, or a woman braiding her hair with the help of such a tool. The survival of so many combs speaks to their importance, reminders that even in a rugged world, details of appearance mattered. In their polished teeth, clean hair, and cherished combs, the Vikings reveal a culture attentive to style. Vikings loved ale and mead. Drinking was a central part of Viking gatherings. Ale, brewed from barley, and mead, made from fermented honey, were staples of feasts, rituals, and everyday life. Drinking together symbolized unity and trust, strengthening bonds between warriors and families. In the great halls, horns of ale would be passed, toasts raised to gods, ancestors, or fallen comrades. Mead held special significance, often associated with poetry, myth, and the divine. The sagas describe nights filled with drinking, storytelling, and song, where cups were as essential as swords. Brewing was a household skill, and women often prepared the ale, ensuring supply for celebrations. Imagine the golden glow of firelight on a hall, cups raised high, voices lifted in song, the warmth of drink mixing with the warmth of fellowship. For the Vikings, ale and mead were not just beverages, they were rituals of community. The Viking alphabet had no letter for O. The written language of the Vikings used runes, an ancient alphabet known as the Futhark. Unlike our modern alphabet, it did not contain every sound we recognize today. For example, there was no direct symbol for the letter O. Instead, different runes were used to represent similar sounds, depending on context. This flexibility made runes both mysterious and adaptable. They were carved into stone, wood, bone, and metal, serving as inscriptions for memorials, charms, and ownership marks. Writing was not everyday practice, but something special, often carrying spiritual or symbolic weight. To carve words into wood or stone was an act of permanence, far different from the casual scrawl of ink on parchment. The absence of certain letters reminds us that language is always changing. The runes were not incomplete, but perfectly suited to the world of the Vikings, shaped to match their own voices. They believed the world tree Yggdrasil held 9 realms. Norse mythology described the cosmos as a vast tree called Yggdrasil. Its roots and branches connected 9 different realms: the world of humans, the realms of gods, the land of giants, the underworld, and more. At its base lurked serpents, while its crown reached the heavens. The tree was alive with meaning, a symbol of balance and connection. For the Vikings, this myth shaped their worldview. Life was not a simple line, but a great network, with every being and realm bound together. Around their fires, they told stories of Odin hanging upon Yggdrasil to gain wisdom, of squirrels running along its trunk carrying gossip, and of the final destruction of the tree at Ragnarok. To believe in Yggdrasil was to see life as vast and interconnected, stretching beyond what eyes could see. It gave the Norse a cosmic map of existence itself. Viking children played with miniature boats and swords. Childhood in Viking society was not all work. Archaeological digs have uncovered small wooden boats, carved swords, and toy animals that children once played with. These toys were not only for fun, but also preparation for adult life. A boy pushing a tiny ship across the dirt was rehearsing the voyages he might one day take. A girl weaving thread with miniature spindles was practicing the skills she would carry into her household. The toys also reflected the world around them, where seafaring, farming, and storytelling were central. Play was a way of learning, but it was also joy, a reminder that Viking children laughed, imagined, and created, just like children everywhere. These little objects, fragile yet enduring, give us an intimate glimpse into Viking homes. Beyond raids and sagas, there were children at play, dreaming of futures carried on wooden ships and stories. They told stories of sea monsters in the deep. The sailors who ventured across unknown waters, the sea was a place of both wonder and fear. Vikings told tales of monstrous creatures that lurked beneath the waves, serpents so vast they encircled the world, or beasts that could drag ships down into the dark. Some of these stories may have been inspired by real encounters with whales, giant squids, or storms that seemed alive in their fury. The sagas describe the terrifying Hafgufa, a sea monster that opened its jaws so wide it could swallow entire ships. Whether believed literally or told as cautionary tales, these stories reflected the awe the Vikings felt for the ocean. The sea was their pathway to new lands and fortunes, but it was also unpredictable and dangerous. To sail into it required courage and perhaps a healthy respect for the monsters of the deep. The Varangian Guard in Byzantium was made of Vikings. Far from home, Viking warriors became elite bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. Known as the Varangian Guard, these men were valued for their loyalty, strength, and skill. Dressed in fine armor and wielding massive axes, they stood at the heart of the empire's splendor, protecting the emperor in palaces and on campaigns. Chroniclers describe them as fierce and unshakable, willing to fight to the death for their master. For the Vikings who joined, it was a path to wealth and prestige, serving in the most powerful city of the medieval world. Some returned home with stories, treasures, and silks, while others stayed, their lives forever tied to Byzantium. To imagine a Norseman standing guard beneath golden mosaics and domes is to glimpse the global reach of the Viking spirit, from northern fjords to the shining heart of an empire. Vikings tattooed their skin with knots and symbols. Though physical evidence has not survived, Arab travelers who met the Vikings described them as heavily tattooed with designs of trees, animals, and intricate knots. These tattoos may have carried spiritual significance, marking identity, clan, or personal belief. They would have echoed the patterns seen in Viking art, the twisting serpents, runes, and interlaced designs carved into wood and stone. Tattoos may also have been a way of carrying one's story on the skin, visible to all. Picture a Viking sailor with forearms inked in dark knots, symbols of strength and protection, catching the firelight in a longhouse. Whether decorative or sacred, such tattoos reflect the Viking love of design and meaning. Just as their ships and tools bore carvings, so too might their bodies have carried the art of their world, living symbols etched into flesh. Their ships were clinker-built, overlapping planks for strength. The strength of Viking ships lay in their unique construction. They were clinker-built, meaning the wooden planks overlapped like shingles, fastened with iron rivets. This technique created a flexible but sturdy hull, able to bend with the waves rather than break. It also made the ships lighter and faster, perfect for both ocean voyages and river journeys. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with each plank shaped and fitted by hand. Archaeologists studying shipwrecks marvel at the precision and beauty of the work, done without modern tools. The result was a vessel that could withstand storms and glide swiftly across water. The clinker method became so effective that it influenced shipbuilding for centuries after. Each Viking ship was not only a tool of travel, but a masterpiece of design, embodying the harmony of wood, iron, and the hands of skilled builders. Viking women wore keys at their belts as status. In Viking society, women managed households and had authority over property and possessions. A symbol of this role was the key, often worn at the belt as part of daily dress. Keys unlocked chests that held food, tools, and valuables, making them symbols of both practical responsibility and status. In graves, archaeologists have found women buried with keys, showing how important they were in life and memory. These keys were often beautifully crafted, sometimes decorated with patterns, making them as much ornament as tool. To wear keys was to show trust and authority, marking a woman's role as keeper of the household. Imagine a Viking woman in bright clothing, keys jingling at her side as she moved through her home. A subtle yet powerful reminder of the respect women commanded in their communities. They used soapstone pots that lasted generations. Cooking vessels in Viking homes were often made of soapstone, a soft rock that could withstand heat and last for decades. These pots were carved by hand, heavy but durable, passed down through families as heirlooms. Soapstone retained heat well, making it perfect for simmering stews over central fires. Archaeological finds reveal that some pots were repaired multiple times, showing how valued they were. Imagine a pot used by a grandmother, then her daughter, then her granddaughter, each one stirring the same vessel with new meals across generations. In a world where tools were precious, such objects carried both utility and memory. They remind us that the Vikings were not only explorers and warriors, but also homemakers, cherishing the tools that fed their families and bound them together around the warmth of fire and food. Vikings had law speakers who memorized entire codes. Because Viking laws were spoken aloud, the community relied on men called law speakers, who committed vast codes of law to memory. These individuals stood at things, public assemblies, and recited rules for property, trade, marriage, and justice. It was an extraordinary feat of memory, requiring skill and training. The law speaker was a living library, ensuring continuity across generations. To stand in a crowd and hear the measured voice of the law speaker was to feel the weight of order, binding the community together. This oral tradition made law not a distant authority, but a shared experience, spoken into the open air for all to hear. The role shows the Vikings' respect for memory, tradition, and accountability. Before books or parchments, they relied on human voices to preserve their rules. A reminder that in Viking society, knowledge itself was alive. Viking explorers may have seen polar bears in Greenland. When Norse settlers reached Greenland, they entered a landscape of icy fjords, glaciers, and wildlife unlike anything in their homelands. Among the creatures they may have encountered were polar bears. These powerful animals, perfectly adapted to the Arctic, would have seemed both awe-inspiring and dangerous. The sagas mention white bears, and hunters may have captured them for trade, offering them as exotic gifts to European courts. For most Vikings, however, such encounters would have been rare and memorable, tales worth retelling by firelight. To see a polar bear against the snow must have seemed like glimpsing a spirit of the ice itself, a living symbol of the harsh northern world. These encounters remind us that the Vikings were not only sailors and warriors, but explorers, stepping into lands where even the animals seemed shaped by myth. They played a violent ball game called Natalika. Recreation for the Vikings could be as intense as their battles. One of the traditional games, called Natalika, was a rough ball game played on open fields. Teams faced off using sticks and sometimes bare hands to hit and carry a hard ball, while tackling and wrestling were part of the fun. The sagas describe it as fast, physical, and sometimes dangerous, with rivalries lasting long after the game ended. For young men, it was a chance to prove strength and skill, and for communities, it was entertainment during gatherings. Imagine a frozen field filled with shouting players, the crack of sticks, and the cheers of onlookers. Though less remembered today, Natalica was part of the Vikings' blend of sport and toughness, where play itself mirrored the intensity of their lives. It was as much about pride and endurance as about scoring a goal. Vikings carved charms into their weapons. Weapons were tools of survival, but for Vikings, they could also be vessels of magic. Archaeologists have discovered swords and spears engraved with runes, symbols believed to carry protection, strength, or even luck in battle. A warrior might carve the rune Tiwaz for victory, or inscribe his weapon with personal marks of ownership and blessing. These engravings transformed steel into something more than metal. They became charms, blending craftsmanship and belief. The sagas speak of enchanted blades, feared for their supposed power. Whether superstition or confidence, such practices reflect the Vikings' deep sense that the spiritual world touched every part of life. To hold a weapon inscribed with runes was to carry both iron and intention, forging a bond between human, tool, and unseen forces. The carvings remind us that for the Vikings, symbols mattered as much as steel. Some shields were painted bright yellow or red. Viking shields were not only protective, but also expressive. Round and usually made from lindenwood, many were covered in painted designs. Bright colors like yellow and red were common, standing out on the battlefield or at sea. A wall of warriors holding such shields would have created a striking sight, a wave of vivid circles advancing in unison. Paint also helped protect the wood from weather, preserving it during long voyages. Each shield might bear personal or clan markings, turning it into a symbol of identity as well as defense. Imagine a warrior raising his red shield in the sun, its color glowing against the gray northern sky. In battle, these shields were barriers, but in life, they were statements of pride and artistry. The Vikings brought color even to the tools of war, blending practicality with bold visual impact. Viking merchants traded furs, honey, and slaves. The Vikings were not only raiders, but also shrewd traders. Their markets buzzed with goods, furs from the north, honey from their farms, walrus ivory, amber, and crafted items of bone and metal. Unfortunately, one of their trade commodities was human beings. Captives taken during raids were sold as slaves, exchanged across Europe and beyond. While uncomfortable to imagine, it was part of the global economy of the time, shared by many cultures. These slaves, called thralls, were used in households and farms. Alongside this darker trade, Viking merchants also carried goods that connected Scandinavia to faraway lands: silver from the Middle East, silk from Byzantium, spices and glassware from Europe. Their trading networks stretched astonishing distances, linking frozen fjords with bustling southern cities. The Vikings' role as traders shows how deeply they were tied into a web of commerce, both admirable and troubling. They navigated using the sunstone crystal. Without compasses, Viking sailors relied on natural tools, and one of the most fascinating was the so-called sunstone. This was likely a crystal, such as Iceland's spar, capable of polarizing light. Even when the sun was hidden by clouds, sailors could hold up the stone and rotate it until the sky's light appeared most intense, revealing the sun's hidden position. This allowed them to steer accurately even in foggy or overcast conditions. The sagas describe the use of such stones, and modern experiments suggest it would have worked remarkably well. Picture a Viking captain holding a gleaming crystal against a grey sky, finding the sun invisible to the eye. It reveals how ingenuity and observation allowed the Norse to cross vast seas. The sunstone remains one of the most magical-sounding yet practical tools of their seafaring world. Vikings set up camps on the rivers of Russia. The Vikings who traveled east, often called Varangians, followed the great rivers of Russia, the Volga, the Dnieper, into the heart of Europe and Asia. Along the way, they established trading posts and camps, places to rest, repair ships, and barter with local peoples. These river networks became highways linking the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and beyond. At these camps, Norse merchants mingled with Slavs, Finns, and other groups, exchanging furs and silver, telling stories, and forging alliances. Over time, some Vikings settled permanently, blending into local societies and even giving rise to the early state of Rus, from which Russia would eventually emerge. Imagine longships pulled up on a riverbank, sails drying, fires crackling as traders prepared goods. These quiet camps were stepping stones in the vast Viking web of exploration, connecting north and south in surprising ways. Their funerals sometimes included human sacrifice. Accounts from Arab chroniclers who met Vikings in the east describe striking funerary practices. In rare cases, alongside the burial of a chieftain, another person, often a servant or captive, was sacrificed to accompany the dead into the afterlife. While unsettling by modern standards, such rituals reflected the Vikings' belief in companionship beyond death, and in ensuring their leaders entered the next world with honor and attendance. Archaeological finds of graves containing multiple individuals lend support to these reports, though they seem to have been exceptions rather than the rule. More commonly, Vikings were buried with goods, animals, and tools. This practice, however rare, reveals the depth of their spiritual conviction, that life after death mirrored life itself. In their eyes, the journey to the afterlife required not only ships and treasures, but also the company of others. Vikings practiced trial by ordeal. In disputes, justice sometimes relied on what was called trial by ordeal. One method was to plunge a hand into boiling water or to carry hot iron, after which the wounds were inspected. If they healed cleanly, the accused was considered innocent, as the gods had shown favor. If not, guilt was assumed. While harsh to us today, this system reflected a deep belief that divine forces would reveal truth where human judgment could falter. Trials by ordeal were meant to provide certainty in a world where evidence and records were scarce. They remind us how closely the Vikings connected justice with the sacred. To endure such a trial must have required immense courage and faith that one's innocence would be proven not by men, but by higher powers. They carved dragon heads to scare away sea spirits. The dragon-headed prows of Viking ships were not only impressive, but also protective. These fearsome carvings were believed to frighten away sea monsters and hostile spirits that might endanger a voyage. The prow became a guardian, leading the ship through dangerous waters. Interestingly, when approaching friendly shores or sacred places, Vikings sometimes removed or covered the dragon heads to avoid offending local spirits. This reveals the balance of fear and respect in their beliefs. The sight of a dragon ship cutting across the horizon must have filled enemies with dread and sailors with reassurance. It was both artistry and superstition carved into wood, a reminder that the sea was alive with powers unseen. For the Vikings, every voyage needed guardians, and their ships carried them in the form of snarling beasts at the prow. Some Vikings became kings in foreign lands. The Vikings were not only raiders and traders, but also rulers. Their travels took them deep into Europe, where some carved out kingdoms of their own. In England, Viking leaders established the Danelaw, ruling large territories and shaping local laws. In Ireland, Norse chieftains became kings of coastal settlements, including Dublin. Farther east, Vikings known as Varangians settled along the rivers of Russia, where their leaders became the founders of dynasties, the very roots of the Russian state. Rurik, a Norseman, is remembered as the first ruler of the Rus. These examples show how Viking influence extended far beyond raids. They adapted, settled, and led. Imagine a Norse adventurer, once a sailor on a longship, now wearing a crown in a foreign land, blending cultures and traditions. Their legacy was not only destruction but creation, the forging of new kingdoms in distant lands. They built forts called ring fortresses with perfect geometry. In Denmark, archaeologists have uncovered Viking fortresses that are astonishing in their design. Known as ring forts, they were built as perfect circles, with walls and gates aligned with remarkable precision. Inside, longhouses were arranged in exact symmetry, forming a pattern that spoke of planning and discipline. These were not rough camps, but carefully engineered military bases, capable of housing hundreds of warriors. The best-known example, Trelleborg, reveals wide ramparts and orderly structures that hint at centralized power and organization. To walk through such a fortress would have been to step into geometry made solid, where every angle and curve followed a deliberate plan. These forts remind us that the Vikings were not only masters of the sea, but also capable of advanced land construction. Their eye for symmetry and order challenges the stereotype of chaos, showing instead a society that valued structure and strength. Vikings used sled dogs in the far north. For Viking settlers in Greenland and explorers pushing into Arctic regions, sled dogs became vital companions. Adapted to cold and capable of pulling heavy loads across snow, these animals made travel possible in landscapes too harsh for horses. Archaeological remains of dog bones, along with sled traces, suggest that the Norse learned to work with these loyal animals, perhaps borrowing techniques from Inuit neighbors. Sled dogs extended human endurance, allowing hunters and traders to move further and faster over ice. Imagine the sound of sled runners gliding across snow, the panting of dogs, the crunch of frost beneath their paws. In a world where survival depended on adaptation, the Vikings embraced the partnership of humans and animals. These dogs were not just beasts of burden, but allies, carrying the Norse across white horizons at the very edge of the known world. Norse mythology inspired their daily rituals. The Vikings' myths were not distant stories, but living beliefs that shaped their everyday lives. When thunder rolled, they thought of Thor's chariot. When the sun rose, they imagined it pulled by a shining horse-drawn cart. Rituals were woven into farming, seafaring, and household tasks. A toast of ale might be offered to the gods before a voyage, or charms whispered before planting crops. These rituals connected them to forces they believed governed the world, giving meaning to both danger and blessing. Archaeological finds of amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, carried as protection, show how myth became personal. To live in Viking times was to see the divine everywhere, in the storm, the harvest, the sea. Their myths were not distant tales, but companions, shaping decisions, actions, and the rhythm of daily existence with a sense of awe and presence. They believed thunder was Thor riding his chariot. In Norse belief, thunder was not a random sound of nature, but the rolling wheels of Thor's chariot across the sky. Pulled by two mighty goats, his chariot rattled the heavens, each crash of thunder a reminder of the god's strength. Lightning was the flash of his hammer, Mjolnir, striking against giants or enemies. For the Vikings, these natural forces were alive with personality and power. A storm overhead was not just weather, but Thor himself, protecting humanity from chaos. This belief gave storms a dual nature, fearsome yet reassuring, since they were signs of divine presence. Imagine Viking farmers pausing in their fields as thunder boomed, knowing it was Thor above them. Such myths brought meaning to the unpredictable, turning storms into stories, and the sky into a stage where gods acted in sound and light. Viking traders brought back silk from China. Among the treasures carried into Viking lands was silk, smooth, colorful fabric from the distant east. Fragments of silk have been found in graves across Scandinavia, woven into clothing or used as decoration. These pieces likely traveled along the Silk Road, carried by traders through Persia and Byzantium before reaching Norse merchants. Silk was a mark of prestige, rare and exotic, worn by the wealthy to display power. To imagine a Viking chieftain in bright silk, seated in a smoky longhouse, is to glimpse how global their connections truly were. From the snowy forests of Scandinavia to the looms of China, the trade routes stretched like invisible threads across continents. That such delicate fabric survived the journey shows the resilience of both the material and the networks that carried it. The Vikings were not isolated, they were linked to a world of astonishing breadth. They wrote runes on bones for fortune-telling. Runes were more than letters. They were symbols believed to hold magical force. The Vikings sometimes carved them into small pieces of bone or wood, then cast them like lots to seek guidance. A rune reader would interpret the way the symbols landed, reading answers to questions about travel, harvest, or fate. This practice blended language and belief, turning carved marks into windows of meaning. Some rune stones include cryptic inscriptions thought to be magical formulas rather than ordinary text. Imagine a Viking farmer, uncertain about a voyage, watching as carved bones clattered onto the floor, each rune whispering a hint of destiny. Whether superstition or faith, this practice reveals the deep importance of symbols in Norse culture. For them, writing was never only communication, it was power, and runes carried the potential to connect the human world with the unseen. Viking helmets rarely had nose guards. Though many Viking helmets included simple metal caps or reinforced leather, fewer than imagined had elaborate features like nose guards. The famous Gjermundbu helmet, the only nearly complete Viking helmet found, does include a nose piece, but this was likely unusual. Most warriors may have worn more basic protection, relying on shields and agility rather than heavy armor. Helmets were costly to make, and not every fighter could afford them. Some may have entered battle with little more than courage and a wooden shield. The scarcity of nose guards shows how functional Viking gear tended to be, practical rather than decorative. Despite the popular image of iron-faced warriors, the reality was simpler, but no less impressive. To hold even a fragment of one today is to feel the presence of lives who fought and endured with modest but effective protection. They used whale bones as building beams. On windswept coasts where wood was scarce, Vikings turned to other materials, including whale bones. Archaeological evidence in places like Greenland shows long bones used as beams in houses, supporting turf roofs and adding strength. These bones came from stranded whales or successful hunts, their massive size making them suitable for construction. Imagine a home with a ceiling supported by curved ribs, part of a creature once alive in the sea. Such houses would have carried a sense of connection to the ocean, blending survival with symbolism. Using whale bones reflects the adaptability of the Vikings, who drew on whatever resources their environment offered. It also shows a culture unafraid to integrate the natural world into their homes, making the remains of sea giants part of their daily shelter. Vikings sometimes buried dogs with warriors. In Viking graves, archaeologists have occasionally found dogs laid to rest alongside their human companions. These were not ordinary animals, but trusted partners in life, hunting dogs, guardians, or beloved pets. Their presence in graves suggests that they were seen as loyal even beyond death, ready to accompany their masters into the afterlife. Such burials remind us of the bond between humans and animals, stretching across centuries. Imagine a warrior buried with his sword, shield, and at his side, the faithful dog who had shared his journeys. It is a poignant image, showing that love and loyalty were honored as much as weapons and wealth. These graves reveal that, for the Vikings, dogs were more than animals. They were companions worthy of memory, woven into both daily life and eternal rest. Vikings built saunas in Iceland. When Norse settlers arrived in Iceland, they discovered the island's hot springs and quickly made use of them. Bathing and steaming became part of daily life, and the Vikings built primitive saunas near these geothermal sites. A sauna was more than relaxation, it was health, cleansing, and social ritual. Families or neighbors gathered in the heat, washing away the chill of northern winds. Archaeological remains show stone structures designed to channel steam, much like later bathhouses. To step into such a place, with steam rising from volcanic waters and snow lying outside, must have felt like stepping into a sacred gift from the earth. These saunas reflected the Vikings' adaptability, blending their love of cleanliness with Iceland's unique environment. They remind us that even in harsh landscapes, the Norse found ways to create comfort and warmth, turning natural forces into everyday havens of rest. Their ships were so light they could be carried. One of the remarkable features of Viking ships was their lightness. Longships were designed to be hauled across land when rivers became impassable or when raiders needed to cross from one waterway to another. Warriors could lift the vessel on rollers or carry it over short distances, a feat made possible by clever construction and the use of overlapping planks. This mobility meant that Vikings could appear in places no one expected, striking deep inland or bypassing fortifications. Imagine a group of sailors dragging their ship across a grassy plain, the wooden hull gleaming as it slid over logs. It must have been a sight both bewildering and intimidating for those who witnessed it. This ability gave the Vikings an advantage that seemed almost magical. Ships that did not obey the limits of rivers and seas, but moved wherever determination required. Vikings believed Valkyries chose the slain in battle. In Viking belief, death in battle was not random. Warriors thought that Valkyries, supernatural maidens of Odin, hovered over battlefields, selecting which fighters would fall and which would live. Those chosen were taken to Valhalla, the great hall of the slain, where they would feast with the gods until the end of the world. The presence of Valkyries turned war into destiny, making courage and honor essential. To fight bravely was not only survival, but a way to earn a place among the chosen. Valkyries were depicted as beautiful yet fearsome, riding horses through the sky with spears and shields. Their image appears in carvings and poems, reflecting both awe and reverence. For the Vikings, the thought of Valkyries watching gave meaning to the chaos of battle, a reminder that the gods themselves were near, guiding the fate of men. Some warriors swore oaths on sacred rings. Oaths were sacred in Viking culture, binding not only before men, but also before the gods. Warriors sometimes swore their loyalty on great arm rings or temple rings, kept in places of worship or law. These rings were often made of silver or gold, gleaming with symbolic weight. To break such an oath was not just dishonor, but spiritual betrayal. The sagas described men pledging themselves to kings, chieftains, or causes by touching these rings, calling the gods as witnesses. Imagine a hall filled with flickering firelight, a warrior laying his hand upon a heavy silver ring, his words echoing with the weight of destiny. Such rituals reveal how seriously the Vikings took promises. In a world where law was spoken and memory held power, Oaths were more than words. They were the foundation of trust, sealed with sacred metal. Viking laws punished cow thieves with exile. In Viking society, cattle were vital, and stealing one was a grave crime. The punishment was often exile, banishment from the community, stripped of protection and belonging. Exile was worse than death for some, for it meant isolation in a harsh world where survival depended on kin and support. The sagas recount tales of men outlawed, forced to wander as outcasts. Such punishments reveal how deeply the Vikings valued order and property. Cattle were not merely animals but lifelines, providing milk, meat, and wealth. To steal one was to attack the very heart of survival. Imagine the weight of such a sentence. A man leaving behind his home, his fire, and his people, cast into the wilderness. Viking law may have been strict, but it upheld the fragile balance of their society, where community was everything, and exile was a fate feared above most others. They drank from horns at feasts. Few images are as iconic as Vikings raising drinking horns at great feasts. These horns, polished and sometimes decorated with metal rims, were used to drink ale or mead. They held more than liquid, they carried symbolism, turning an ordinary act into ritual. Passing the horn from hand to hand created bonds of fellowship, each toast uniting the group. At celebrations, warriors and families would drink together, honoring gods, ancestors, and victories. Imagine a longhouse filled with laughter and music, firelight glowing on golden drink as horns were raised high. These gatherings were not only about food and drink, but about community, cementing ties of loyalty and kinship. Drinking from horns turned feasts into sacred moments, where every sip echoed with tradition. They remind us that for the Vikings, even joy was ritualized, woven into the fabric of life. Vikings carved chess pieces shaped like kings and berserkers. Among the most famous medieval artifacts are the Lewis chessmen, found in Scotland but likely carved by Norse artisans. Made of walrus ivory, these pieces include kings, queens, bishops, knights, and warriors with fierce expressions. Some depict berserkers biting their shields, eyes wide, as if caught in a moment of frenzy. These chessmen reveal how the game of strategy was embraced in Viking culture, reflecting their love of contests of wit as well as strength. To hold one today is to feel the artistry of Norse craftsmen who turned ivory into miniature worlds of power and play. Imagine a chieftain leaning over a chessboard by firelight, plotting moves with pieces carved into warriors and kings. The blend of artistry, strategy, and symbolism in these objects shows how the Vikings combined imagination with intellect, turning play into an echo of their worldview. Some Vikings wore cloaks made of bird feathers. Clothing in Viking society could be practical, but sometimes it was spectacular. Some high-status individuals wore cloaks adorned with bird feathers, creating garments that shimmered with color and movement. Such cloaks may have had symbolic meaning, connecting the wearer to birds, creatures of freedom, flight, and the skies. In myth, gods and goddesses sometimes donned feathered cloaks to travel between worlds. Archaeological finds of feather remains in graves suggest that these garments were real, not only legendary. Imagine a Viking stepping into a hall with a cloak of raven or swan feathers, each movement catching the firelight, evoking both beauty and power. These cloaks were more than clothing. They were statements, wrapping the wearer in symbols of the natural and mythic worlds. They remind us of the Vikings' love of blending the practical with the symbolic, turning attire into living myth. They hunted walrus for their tusks. In Greenland and Arctic waters, walruses were hunted for their ivory tusks, hides, and meat. The tusks were especially valuable, traded across Europe as luxury materials for carvings, religious items, and ornaments. Walrus ivory became an important part of the Viking economy, connecting remote settlements to global markets. Hunting these massive creatures was dangerous, requiring skill and courage. A single walrus could weigh over a ton and fight fiercely to protect itself. Yet the rewards were great, and tusks from Greenland made their way to distant cities. The Lewis chessmen, for instance, were likely carved from walrus ivory. This trade shows how even the farthest edges of Viking expansion were tied to international demand. The walrus, a creature of ice and sea, became part of the story of Norse exploration and adaptation, bridging Arctic hunts with medieval European wealth. Vikings carried fire-starting kits in pouches. Survival in northern landscapes meant always being ready to make fire. Vikings carried small pouches with flint, steel, and tinder, often dried fungus or fibers that caught sparks easily. These kits were essential tools, tucked into belts like modern travelers might carry matches. Archaeological finds confirm their presence in graves, emphasizing their importance. To strike steel against flint, watching sparks leap onto tinder, was to create warmth, light, and safety in a cold world. Fire meant life, and every Viking needed the skill to kindle it quickly. Imagine a group of travelers stopping along a riverbank, pulling out pouches, and within minutes, flames leaping up to cook food and ward off the night. These humble kits remind us that exploration depended not only on great ships and daring, but also on the small, everyday tools that kept life burning bright. They carved runes into cliff faces. Beyond stones and artifacts, Vikings sometimes carved runes directly into cliff walls and rock faces. These inscriptions were often memorials or marks of presence, left in places where travelers or sailors would see them. Some cliffs in Scandinavia, and even abroad, bear these runic messages, scratched into stone to endure the ages. They might proclaim, "So-and-so carved these runes," or tell of voyages and names. To carve into a cliff was to leave a lasting record, visible against sky and sea. Imagine a Viking pausing on a journey, hammering runes into a sheer rock, determined to leave a voice echoing across centuries. These cliff carvings are the closest thing to ancient graffiti, personal, proud, and enduring. They remind us that even in a world of grand sagas, individuals wanted to be remembered, to say simply, "I was here, and this was my mark." Vikings had nicknames like Bloodaxe and Forkbeard. Norse culture was full of colorful nicknames, often describing appearance, deeds, or personality. Some were intimidating, like Eric Bloodaxe, a king known for his ferocity. Others were descriptive, such as Sweyn Forkbeard, named for his distinctive beard style. Nicknames could also be humorous or unflattering. There are sagas of men called the Stout, the Short, or even Dunbeard. These names served as identifiers in societies where many shared the same first names. They also carried a sense of personality, turning leaders and warriors into vivid characters. Imagine hearing tales around the fire of men called by these bold names, each one conjuring an image immediately. The nicknames reveal the Viking love of sharp words, humor, and reputation. They remind us that for all their sternness, the Norse also enjoyed playfulness in language, making names as memorable as deeds. Some warriors filed their teeth into sharp points. Among the most startling Viking discoveries are skeletons with filed teeth. Warriors sometimes carved shallow grooves into the enamel of their front teeth, sharpening or decorating them. These modifications may have been filled with pigment to make them stand out more. The purpose is debated, perhaps to intimidate enemies or to signal belonging to a certain group. Imagine facing a warrior whose grin revealed pointed, patterned teeth, a sight that would leave a lasting impression. This practice shows the Vikings' creativity in self-presentation, turning the body into a canvas for expression. Like tattoos, jewelry, or feathered cloaks, it was a way to craft identity. The filed teeth remind us that appearance mattered deeply in Viking culture, not only for beauty, but for effect. In a world where fear could be as powerful as steel, even a smile became a weapon. They used amber for trade and jewelry. Amber, fossilized tree resin from the shores of the Baltic Sea, was one of the Vikings' prized resources. It glowed golden in sunlight, warm and smooth to the touch. The Norse carved it into beads, pendants, and ornaments, wearing it as jewelry or offering it as a trade good. Amber was valued across Europe and even the Middle East, where it was seen as exotic and magical. Some believed it had protective powers, guarding the wearer from harm. Archaeological finds show amber pieces buried in graves, treasured possessions meant to accompany the dead. Imagine traders carrying sacks of golden amber along rivers, exchanging it for silver, spices, or silk. The shimmering substance connected northern forests to distant markets. For the Vikings, amber was more than decoration. It was wealth, magic, and beauty, crystallized in a gem formed from ancient trees. Viking sails were sometimes striped red and white. While Viking ships are often imagined with plain sails, evidence suggests that some were brightly decorated. Striped sails of red and white, dyed with natural pigments, would have stood out vividly against the sea and sky. Such sails were both practical and symbolic, declaring identity and power. A fleet with striped sails approaching the shore must have looked both beautiful and terrifying, like a wall of color sweeping over the horizon. Sails required great effort to make, weaving vast amounts of wool, treating it with animal fat to repel water, and dyeing it carefully. To decorate them further shows pride and presence. These sails remind us that Viking life was not all muted tones of wood and iron. It was also filled with boldness and color. They sailed not only with strength, but with spectacle, their ships becoming moving symbols of Norse identity. They carried portable scales to weigh silver. Silver was a key form of Viking wealth, and it was traded not only in coins, but also in ingots, jewelry, and chopped fragments known as hack silver. To ensure fairness in trade, Vikings carried small portable scales and weights, often tucked into pouches. Archaeological finds of these scales reveal how merchants and travelers kept careful track of value. At a marketplace, a trader might pour silver into a balance pan, measuring it precisely against tiny standardized weights. This shows how sophisticated their economy was, relying on measurement and trust rather than fixed currency alone. Imagine a merchant by the riverbank, opening his pouch and setting up a small scale on a flat stone, the silver pieces gleaming as they balanced. These tools reveal the practicality behind Viking trade, where wealth was counted carefully, one weight at a time. Vikings traveled as far as Morocco. The reach of Viking voyages was astonishing. Evidence suggests that Norse traders and adventurers made it as far south as Morocco, at the edge of Africa. Silver coins, Arabic accounts, and Norse artifacts point to these surprising connections. Traveling down European rivers and along coasts, they reached the Mediterranean, where new markets awaited. Imagine a Viking, born among snowy fjords, standing in the bustling markets of North Africa, surrounded by scents of spices and the sound of languages far different from his own. Such journeys highlight how global their world truly was, stretching across continents. They were not confined to northern raids, but part of a much larger story of exchange and exploration. To think of Vikings under the sun of Morocco is to feel the vast scope of their wanderings, spanning from Arctic ice to desert sands. They trained children in archery from a young age. In Viking culture, skills for survival were taught early. Children learned to handle bows, spears, and tools as soon as they were able. Archery in particular was an important skill, useful for hunting as well as defense. Archaeological finds of small bows suggest that young people practiced with scaled-down versions, honing accuracy and strength. The sagas sometimes mention children demonstrating surprising skill with weapons, admired by their elders. Imagine a boy or girl on a meadow's edge, bowstring drawn, loosing an arrow toward a target carved into a tree. Such practice prepared them not only for war, but for providing food and security. Teaching children early ensured that by adulthood, they were skilled and confident. It reminds us that Viking society relied on every member, with even the youngest drawn into the rhythms of survival and responsibility. Viking graves sometimes contained gaming boards. The love of games extended even into death. Archaeologists have discovered Viking graves that include gaming boards and pieces, buried alongside weapons and jewelry. This suggests that games were seen as important in life, and perhaps in the afterlife. Hnefatafl, the strategic board game of king and attackers, appears often, reflecting its popularity. To bury someone with a game was to provide not only tools and weapons, but also leisure, intellect, and companionship for eternity. Imagine a grave filled with goods, a sword, a shield, and a gaming board waiting beside them. Such finds remind us that the Vikings were not only practical but also playful, valuing strategy and wit as much as strength. Their graves tell us what they cherished, and games held a meaningful place in that vision of life beyond death. They believed the sky was made from a giant skull. In Norse mythology, the world itself was created from the body of a slain giant named Ymir. From his flesh came the earth, from his blood, the seas, and from his skull, the sky. The gods placed the skull high above, supported by 4 dwarves at its corners, creating the dome of the heavens. This striking image shows how vividly the Norse imagined their world, blending nature with myth. To them, the very sky was not empty, but the remains of a cosmic being, a reminder of the deep roots of existence. Imagine looking up at the stars and thinking of them shining within the curve of a giant skull. Such myths gave grandeur and story to the cosmos, making the ordinary extraordinary. They reflect the Vikings' gift for storytelling, turning the very fabric of the world into a tale of creation and wonder. Viking ships used wool sails waterproofed with animal fat. The great Viking ships were powered not only by oars, but by vast square sails, woven from wool. To make them strong enough for the sea, women spun and wove enormous amounts of yarn, then treated the cloth with animal fat, fish oil, or even butter to repel water. This process made the sails heavy but durable, able to withstand wind and spray. A single sail might take years to complete, representing the work of an entire household. Dyed with natural pigments, some sails were striped or brightly colored, turning ships into bold moving banners across the sea. Imagine the sight of a fleet, sails billowing in the wind, catching sunlight as they drove across the horizon. These sails were more than fabric. They were the wings of the Viking world, carrying them to distant lands, woven with care and made resilient by craft and ingenuity. They carved picture stones with myths and battles. Across Scandinavia, especially in Sweden, the Vikings raised tall stones covered in carved images, ships, warriors, animals, and scenes from myth. These picture stones served as memorials and storytelling devices, bringing to life the sagas in visual form. One stone might show a ship filled with warriors, another a rider approaching Valhalla, or a serpent encircling a god. For people who lived in an oral culture, These carvings acted like visual echoes of the stories told around fires. They also stood as lasting reminders of identity and belief, set into landscapes where they would endure for centuries. To stand before a picture stone today is to feel as though you are gazing at a comic strip from the Viking Age, carved into rock instead of inked on parchment. These stones prove that art and memory were as central as weapons in Norse life. Vikings wrote poetry called skaldic verse. The poetry of the Vikings was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Known as skaldic verse, it was dense, intricate, and full of layered metaphors called kennings. A ship might be called ASTSD, or blood described as the battle sweat of warriors. Skalds, the poets who composed these works, performed at feasts and courts, weaving tales that praised leaders or mocked rivals. The complexity of their verse was a kind of verbal swordplay, admired as much as skill in combat. To recite or compose such poetry required sharp wit and memory. Imagine a hall falling silent as a skald rose, his voice turning words into magic, weaving images of gods and heroes. These poems were not only art but records preserving events and reputations. Through skaldic verse, the Vikings proved that their greatest weapons were not only iron, but also words. Some wore brooches shaped like animals. Viking clothing was often fastened with brooches, and many of these were crafted into the shapes of animals, birds, wolves, serpents, and horses. Made of bronze, silver, or even gold, these brooches were both practical and symbolic. They secured cloaks or tunics, but they also expressed identity and belief. Animals held deep meaning in Norse culture. Ravens for wisdom, wolves for power, serpents for mystery. To wear one was to carry a symbol of those qualities. Archaeological finds show that these brooches were richly decorated, often with twisting, interlaced patterns characteristic of Viking art. Imagine a woman fastening her cloak with a silver bird-shaped brooch, or a warrior pinning his clothing with a snarling wolf. These small objects combined artistry with function, turning everyday dress into statements of style and symbolism. They reveal the Viking eye for detail, where even fasteners became miniature works of meaning. Viking ships could average 10 knots at sea. The speed of Viking longships was astonishing for that time. With their sleek design, shallow draft, and powerful square sails, they could average 10 knots, about 11.5 miles per hour, and sometimes more with favorable winds. This made them faster than most contemporary ships, able to cover vast distances in short times. Combined with their ability to row when winds failed, longships were versatile and relentless. Imagine a fleet moving swiftly across the sea, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of days, striking without warning. The design of these ships gave the Vikings their unmatched mobility, allowing them to raid, trade, and explore across half the globe. Their speed was more than a technical detail. It was the heartbeat of the Viking Age, turning wooden vessels into arrows loosed across the oceans of the world. They kept falcons and hawks as prized animals. Among the animals treasured by Vikings, birds of prey held a special place. Falcons and hawks were symbols of status, trained for hunting and admired for their beauty. To own one was a mark of nobility, and these birds were sometimes given as gifts to kings and emperors in distant lands. Training them required patience and skill, creating a bond between bird and handler. In mythology, gods themselves were associated with falcons and ravens, deepening their symbolic power. Imagine a Viking chieftain standing in the crisp air, a falcon on his glove, its sharp eyes scanning the horizon. These birds embodied grace, strength, and freedom, qualities admired by the Norse. Their presence in art and sagas shows how highly they were valued, not only as hunters, but as living emblems of the skies. companions to humans who longed to fly beyond horizons. Viking warriors carried round shields of linden wood. The iconic Viking shield was round, often about a meter across, and commonly made of linden wood. This wood was light yet strong, making it perfect for both defense and maneuverability. Shields were covered in leather and reinforced with a central iron boss, which could deflect blows or be used offensively. Painted in bright colors, they created a wall of circles when warriors stood together in formation. The shield war was a central tactic of Viking battle, uniting fighters into a single barrier of wood and iron. Imagine the sound of shields clashing as they locked together, a rhythm of protection and defiance. These shields were not only tools of war, but also canvases for expression, with each painted design marking individuality or group identity. They were as symbolic as they were practical, turning wood into both protection and pride. They burned incense made from pine resin. Life in smoky longhouses could be heavy, and the Vikings found ways to freshen the air. Archaeologists have discovered lumps of pine resin that were burned as incense, releasing a sharp, clean scent. This resin, gathered from forests, not only masked odors but also had antibacterial properties. Burning it was both practical and possibly spiritual, as sweet-smelling smoke carried associations of cleansing and ritual. Imagine the air inside a hall softening with the fragrance of pine, mingling with wood smoke and the aroma of cooking. Such small comforts reveal the humanity of Viking life, where even in rugged conditions, people sought beauty and balance. Incense reminds us that they were not only warriors and explorers, but also individuals who cared for their homes, filling them with warmth, light, and scents that lifted the spirit. Vikings set up markets called things. A thing was both a market and a political assembly, central to Viking life. People gathered at these open-air events to trade goods, settle disputes, and make decisions for the community. Merchants spread out wares, furs, amber, silver, food, and tools, while law speakers recited codes and chieftains debated. Things were as much about social life as business, places where news traveled, marriages were arranged, and alliances forged. Imagine the bustle of a Viking marketplace. Ships pulled up nearby, goods displayed on banquets, voices rising in barter. These gatherings show the Vikings as not only raiders, but participants in a structured society, where order and trade balanced conflict. The thing was democracy in its early form, a reminder that Viking communities valued shared decision-making as much as they valued strength. They held winter feasts, lasting days. When winter came and work slowed, the Vikings celebrated with feasts that could last several days. These gatherings were filled with food, drink, storytelling, and music. Great halls glowed with firelight as families and neighbors gathered to share roasted meats, bread, ale, and mead. Skalds recited poetry, riddles were exchanged, and games were played. Such feasts were more than indulgence, they were vital for social cohesion, reinforcing bonds of kinship and loyalty. For a community enduring the long northern night, these celebrations brought warmth and joy. Imagine the snow falling outside while inside a hall, laughter and song echoed, horns clinked, and stories of gods and heroes stirred imaginations. Winter feasts kept spirits alive, transforming darkness into light. They remind us that even in harsh seasons, the Vikings found ways to celebrate life and create moments of abundance. Vikings reached as far as Newfoundland. Centuries before Columbus, Viking explorers crossed the Atlantic and reached the shores of North America. Archaeological evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland shows remains of Norse buildings, longhouses built with turf, fireplaces, and ironworking sites. These discoveries match the saga's tales of Vinland, a land of forests and grapes across the Western Sea. For the Norse, the journey was extraordinary. Thousands of miles across icy waters, guided by stars and courage. Though the settlements were brief, their presence marks one of the earliest European steps into the New World. Imagine a Viking ship landing on a rocky coast, sails furled, sailors stepping onto unfamiliar ground, surrounded by dense forests. The voyage to Newfoundland shows that the Viking spirit of exploration was limitless, pushing them to the edge of continents and into legend as the first Europeans to set foot in North America. Their descendants became Normans in France. In the early 10th century, Viking raiders settled along the Seine River in northern France. They struck a deal with the French king, receiving land in exchange for peace. This territory became known as Normandy, and the Norse settlers gradually blended with local culture, becoming the Normans. Within generations, they adopted Christianity, spoke French, and built castles, yet their Viking spirit endured. By 1066, their descendant, William the Conqueror, invaded England, forever changing European history. The transformation from sea raiders to castle builders reveals the adaptability of Viking culture. Imagine Norse warriors settling in fertile valleys, raising stone keeps where longhouses once stood, their children speaking a new language but carrying old bloodlines. The Normans show how Viking legacies did not vanish but evolved, reshaping Europe not through raids but through kingdoms that grew from their settlements abroad. Vikings recorded blood feuds and sagas. In Norse society, disputes often spiraled into feuds, cycles of revenge passed down through families. These conflicts, and their tragic consequences, were immortalized in the sagas. Stories like Njol's Saga describe generations entangled in vengeance, where honor demanded retaliation. Yet these sagas were not mere tales of violence. They reflected deep concern for law, justice, and the fragile balance of peace. By recording these feuds, the Vikings preserved lessons for future generations, warnings of how pride could destroy families and communities. Imagine listeners in a smoky hall, hearing the tale of a blood feud unfold, filled with sorrow and wisdom. These sagas show that while the Vikings valued strength, they also reflected critically on the cost of endless conflict. Their stories remind us that history was not only lived but examined, turned into narrative to teach and endure. They used walrus hides for ropes. In the far north, where resources were scarce, the Vikings relied on ingenuity. Walrus hides, thick and durable, were cut into strips and twisted into ropes. These ropes were incredibly strong, used for ships, sleds, and heavy loads. Unlike hemp or flax, walrus hide ropes could endure the harsh Arctic climate, resisting salt and ice. Norse settlers in Greenland especially depended on them, hunting walruses not only for tusks and meat, but also for this unique material. Imagine a Viking ship tethered to shore with rope cut from the hide of a massive sea creature, each fiber a link between human craft and nature's strength. These ropes remind us that Viking survival depended on using every part of the animals they hunted. From tusks to hides, nothing was wasted. Everything became part of the fabric of exploration and endurance. Viking blacksmiths made pattern-welded blades. Among the most prized Viking weapons were swords with pattern-welded blades. Blacksmiths forged them by twisting and layering strips of iron and steel, creating intricate patterns on the metal surface, ripples, waves, or herringbone designs. These blades were not only beautiful but strong, combining flexibility with cutting power. Owning such a sword was a mark of status, often passed down through generations and given names in sagas. Archaeological finds reveal the artistry of these weapons, where craftsmanship turned steel into something alive with design. Imagine a warrior unsheathing a blade that shimmered with flowing patterns, as if water or smoke had been frozen into metal. Pattern welding shows how Viking smiths were not just artisans but artists, blending fire, hammer, and imagination. Their swords were more than tools of war. They were treasures, carrying both skill and soul in every line. They played flutes made of bone. Music was part of Viking life, and archaeologists have uncovered flutes carved from animal bones. These instruments, simple yet effective, produced haunting tones that could fill longhouses with melody. Alongside lyres and horns, bone flutes suggest that Vikings valued not only strength but also sound, rhythm, and beauty. Music accompanied feasts, rituals, and perhaps quiet moments by firelight. Imagine the soft notes of a bone flute drifting through a smoky hall, weaving with the crackle of flames and murmurs of conversation. Children may have practiced on them, or adults used them in ceremonies. These humble instruments remind us that Viking life had gentleness as well as ferocity. The same people who forged swords also carved flutes, finding music in bone and breath. Their songs may be lost to us, but the instruments endure, echoes of melodies that once filled northern nights. Some Vikings wore arm rings of silver. Silver was the currency of the Viking world, and one of its most striking forms was the arm ring. Warriors and traders wore thick bands of silver around their arms, both as display of wealth and as practical currency. In trade, a man might cut off a piece of his arm ring to pay for goods, turning jewelry into money. These rings were also symbols of loyalty. A chieftain might gift one to a follower, sealing bonds of allegiance. The sagas often describe warriors receiving silver rings in reward for service, their arms gleaming with treasure. Imagine a hall where men lifted cups, their wrists heavy with shining bands, each one carrying stories of battles, voyages, or bargains. The arm ring was not only adornment, but identity. Wealth you could wear, loyalty you could display, and memory you could carry, always. They believed the northern lights were Valkyrie shields. In the Viking imagination, the northern lights were more than natural wonder. They were the shining shields of Valkyries, riding across the night sky. The glowing arcs and flickers of green were thought to be reflections of divine armor, lighting the heavens as the maidens of Odin swept to battle. To see them was to feel awe and perhaps destiny, as if the gods were near. Imagine a Viking standing on a snowy shore, looking up at waves of light shimmering like fire across the stars, believing it to be the Valkyries themselves. This interpretation gave beauty a deeper meaning, connecting natural marvels to myth and story. The northern lights became part of the spiritual landscape, turning science into symbolism. For the Norse, every light in the sky was alive, a reminder that the divine world was never far away. Vikings measured land in oxgangs. In Viking society, land was often measured not by size in acres, but by how much could be ploughed with a team of oxen in a season. This unit was called an oxgang. Practical and tied to farming, it reflected how deeply their economy was connected to agriculture. A piece of land was valuable not as abstract space, but as the amount of food and wealth it could produce. This way of thinking shows a people grounded in survival, where farming was as important as raiding or trading. Imagine a farmer leading oxen across a field, their slow steps marking the rhythm by which land was measured. To own an oxgang was to hold not just territory, but livelihood. This system reveals the Viking balance between warrior life and farming roots, where strength of land was measured in the strength of animals. Their legacy reshaped the map of Europe. The Vikings left behind more than sagas and artifacts. They reshaped Europe itself. From Normandy in France to Dublin in Ireland, from Kiev in Ukraine to Iceland in the Atlantic, their settlements became the seeds of nations. They altered trade routes, founded cities, and left genetic and cultural imprints across continents. Their descendants ruled as kings, dukes, and explorers, carrying Norse influence long after the Viking Age ended. The map of Europe today still carries their marks: place names, languages, and traditions rooted in Norse expansion. Imagine the world before their voyages, then after, forever changed by their daring. The Vikings remind us that history is not static, but shaped by movement, encounter, and ambition. Their legacy is written not only in sagas, but in the very geography of Europe, where rivers, towns, and kingdoms trace back to ships of the north. And so, our long journey through the Viking world comes to a gentle close. We've walked the length of their halls, listened to their riddles and poetry, stood beneath the sails of their ships, and followed them across seas and rivers into lands both familiar and far away. Piece by piece, fact by fact, the image of the Vikings becomes more than legend. It becomes a tapestry of lives, woven with strength, skill, and imagination. It is easy to think of them only as raiders or warriors, but tonight we've seen how much more there was. The skalds who shaped words like magic, the children who carved toy boats, the women who wore keys at their belts as signs of authority, the merchants who carried amber and silk across continents, and the explorers who gazed at the northern lights and saw Valkyrie shields glimmering in the sky. What lingers is not just the clash of steel, but the quiet details. A bone flute playing by firelight, a comb carved from antler, a silver arm ring shining on a wrist. These small things remind us that history is built not only of battles, but of homes, stories, and the touch of human hands. As you drift now into rest, imagine the steady rhythm of oars on water, carrying a longship across calm seas beneath the stars. The world is wide, yet here you are, safe and still, with the past gently surrounding you like a cloak. The Vikings are far behind us now, but their echoes remain in language, in place names, in stories, and perhaps even in your own sense of wonder. If you've enjoyed this voyage, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a like, or share a thought in the comments. It helps this channel grow and bring more journeys to life. But for now, you don't need to do anything at all. Just let yourself rest, carried by the tide of history into dreams. Thank you for sailing through time with me tonight. Sleep well, dream deeply, and when you wake, the past will still be waiting, calm, vast, and full of stories. If you happen to still be awake, you can go ahead and watch the next video now. Good night.